Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys. Hello, and welcome back to episode 11 of Podcasts of the Caribbean. This is the second part of our At World's End coverage. If you haven't listened to the first episode, go back and listen to episode 10. That was a really fun episode. And now we're chugging along with At World's End. Before we get back into At World's End, I have a few little things to mention regarding the podcast. So, I finally got the podcast up on a bunch more podcast listening services and platforms. So I'm just going to rattle them off right here. So Podcast of the Caribbean is now available to listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Amazon Music, Overcast, and more. There's a ton of new platforms you can listen on. So if one of those is your preferred listening platform, you can go ahead and now listen to Podcast of the Caribbean on that preferred platform. And of course, if you are not following our social media accounts, make sure you go do that. We're on Twitter at PodcastPOTC and on Instagram at Podcasts of the Caribbean. I post some extra trivia and some videos and photos on there as well. So if you want some more Pirates of the Caribbean in your life, make sure to go follow those pages so we can get some more followers in there. And with all those things out of the way, let's get into At World's End. So we left off last episode right after the Haipeng went over the waterfall at the edge of the world. And of course the screen went black and we had some audio from the original attraction playing, and I talked about that on the last episode. But once we finally get the movie back, it flashes up and we are hit with Davy Jones Locker. And then we are brought right over to a giant nose. And this giant nose belongs to none other than Jack Sparrow. So we're finally back with Jack Sparrow. It's taken us a half an hour in the movie to get back to him. And Jack is currently sniffing out a peanut. And now this peanut gag is a little reoccurrence in this film. It comes back later on. But Jack is ready to eat this singular peanut. And right before he puts it in his mouth, he is shot. And he falls over and drops the peanut. And he is shot by Jack Sparrow. And Jack goes over and grabs the peanut. And he says, "My peanut." And then Jack says, "Haul the halyard, stagger braces." And then we see another Jack Sparrow, and he says, "Aye, Captain, slacken braces." And then we see a whole bunch of Jack Sparrows crewing the Black Pearl, like probably 25 Jack Sparrows running around the Black Pearl. And then I love how they're all running around, and the one Jack Sparrow laying on the deck, he just says, "Help." And then we have another Jack Sparrow walking around and he says, "Man the yards, you filthy toads." And then we have another Jack Sparrow who starts clucking like a duck and lays eggs. And as that clucking Jack walks away, we see another Jack Sparrow sliding closer to a goat. And then, of course, we have a bunch of other Jack Sparrows giving out commands. They're saying, "Hold the sheets handsomely, scandalize the Latines." And then we see this Jack Sparrow moving closer to this goat, which is absolutely fantastic. And then we go over to Jack Sparrow again, and he walks over to a shirtless Jack Sparrow. And Captain Jack Sparrow says, "Mr. Sparrow," and this Jack Sparrow says, "Aye, Captain." And then Captain Jack Sparrow says, "What say you about the condition of this tack line?" And then shirtless Jack Sparrow says, "It be proper to my eyes, sir." And then Captain Jack Sparrow says, "Proper? It is neither probable nor suitable, sir. It is not acceptable nor adequate. It is an obvious fact, an abomination." And he throws the line back into shirtless Jack Sparrow's hands. And shirtless Jack Sparrow then says, "Begging your pardon, sir, but perhaps if you gave a man another chance." And then Captain Jack Sparrow says, "Shall I?" And he pulls out his sword and stabs shirtless Jack Sparrow. And Captain Jack Sparrow gets close and he says, "That sort of thinking got us into this mess." And then he pulls his sword out of shirtless Jack Sparrow and he drops to the deck. And Captain Jack Sparrow wipes his sword on the railing of the Pearl and he says, "We have lost speed and therefore time, precious time, which cannot be recovered once lost. Do you understand?" And all the other Jack Sparrows say, "Aye, Captain." And then Captain Jack Sparrow says, "Do you now? It'll all have to be redone. All of it. And let this serve as a lesson to the lot of you. Doldrums, sir, has the entire crew on edge." And then he says, "I have no sympathy for any of you feculent maggots and no more patience to pretend otherwise." And he runs over to the railing and he grabs a rope and he says, "Gentlemen, I wash my hands of this weirdness." And then he jumps off the ship and lands on the flat sand of Davy Jones Locker. Now, let's go back and recap what just happened in this scene. So, since there's so many Jack Sparrows, I was, of course, referring to Captain Jack Sparrow as the real Jack Sparrow, and then, of course, the other Jack Sparrows. So, of course, it's a lot of fun stuff. A lot of people don't like this scene because of how weird it is. I think it's a great scene because it really shows every side of Jack's personality. It's like every single different facet of Jack Sparrow's personality is split off into another person, and we just see literally every single piece of Jack Sparrow running around. And I think it's really fun. And what I love the most about this scene is when Captain Jack Sparrow, the real Jack, talks to the shirtless Jack Sparrow. And, when shirtless Jack Sparrow says, "Perhaps if you gave a man another chance." And then Jack kills him and says, "That sort of thinking got us into this mess." It's a very great line because, of course, we know Jack to be a guy who, doesn't take no for an answer and always wants to kind of keep going. And we saw that in Dead Man's Chest, how he bargained with Davy Jones for more time in his debt. Give me another chance. And, real Jack at this point, he has understood this, how he's always lived like this. And when he tells shirtless Jack Sparrow, that sort of thinking got us into this mess, he knows now that, trying to extend debts, more chances and stuff like that, that is what got Jack Sparrow killed, and that is what led him to Davy Jones Locker. And I really, really love that scene. I love that line. And, of course, now we're in Davy Jones Locker. Now, real quick, let's talk about how they filmed Davy Jones Locker. So they filmed this scene specifically in the Bonneville Salt Flats. And it's very cool. There's a whole behind-the-scenes featurette of this as well, of them filming. It was really hot because there's nothing around. It's just the sun beating down on you. There was windstorms, a lot of stuff going on. But this was a completely kind of barren landscape, and that's what Gore Verbinski wanted. He wanted this very kind of barren landscape, stretching on forever, no water in sight. Kind of just, the worst prison Jack Sparrow could ever think of, being trapped on land forever with nothing in sight. And it's very, very cool. And it just gives a great effect on this film, just seeing absolutely nothing around Jack Sparrow, and he's just by himself here. So once Jack gets off the Pearl, he licks his finger and puts it up, tries to, feel the wind. And then he, of course, does not feel any wind, and he says, "No wind. Of course there's no bloody wind." Then we have this great shot of Jack Sparrow and the entire Black Pearl, and then we can see just the absolute nothing at all. It's all just sand and flat land, literally nothing in sight. It's such a great look. And then Jack says, "My soul, I do swear for a breeze, a gust, a whisper, a tiny miniature lick." And then after he says that, he sniffs something out and looks down and he sees a rock. So he grabs this rock and he throws it away. And then I love how at this point Jack, of course, even with all the split personalities earlier, he's pretty much been talking to himself because he has no one else to talk to. And I love how in this next line, he's talking to another version of himself. And he says, "Yes, sir, I know, but why? Why would he do that?" And then the other Jack that he's talking to says, "Because he's a lummox, isn't he?" And then Jack says, "We shall have a magnificent garden party, and you're not invited." And I just love these conversations that he's having with himself. It's great. But he senses something, and he turns around again, and the rock he just threw away is right back at his feet. And then, of course, we have the great moment of Jack saying "shoo" and shooing the rock away before he turns around and then turns around again and he sees the rock is still there. So he picks up the rock and then he just says the meaningful words, "a rock." And then he licks the rock. Because at this point, of course, what else is Jack going to do but just lick the rock? So then he throws the rock away again. And this time the camera follows the rock, and we see that the rock is actually a crab. The rock breaks into a crab, or the crab, shifts out of the rock and kind of goes away. And then we go back to Jack, who is walking towards a rope at the bow of the Black Pearl, and he says, "Now we're being followed by rocks. Never had that before." And of course, at this point, Jack has been in the locker for like 2 months. So he is pretty much going insane. He's been by himself in this desolate landscape for 2 whole months. You can understand what that would do to a person, especially Jack Sparrow, who is kind of crazy enough as it is. But he sees this rope and he says, "Oh," and he pulls on the rope, and then it starts coming down a lot of rope just kind of comes out of nowhere. So then Jack has the great idea of trying to pull the Black Pearl using this rope. And of course, it's not really working out for him because the Black Pearl weighs probably 100 times his weight, maybe even more. And I love how, as Jack is trying to pull the Black Pearl, we see that crab just watching him struggle. And Jack is just putting all of his energy into this, and he stops and is panting, and then he just falls back and passes out. Or actually, before he falls back and passes out, he looks over and sees the crab, and then he falls back and just passes out. And while he is passed out, we see a whole bunch more rocks, and we see the crab go over to these rocks, and he starts clicking his claws, and he wakes up all of these crabs that are just chilling out here. And all these crabs start waking up, and they start to follow this first crab over to the Black Pearl. And as they all walk over there, they all start to get under the hull of the Black Pearl, and they start to move the ship. And then I love how as the ship starts moving, we can just see the shadow of the Black Pearl cross over Jack's passed out body. And as he, feels the shadow moving, he wakes up and he sees the Black Pearl moving in front of him. And then he steps back and just looks at his ship moving, seemingly impossible. But then we see a view of all of these crabs helping move the Black Pearl. And he just stands there, absolutely flabbergasted. And then he finally makes the decision to start running after the pearl. And then we have this great shot of Jack running after the black pearl. And then we go right back over to the rest of our main characters who have just washed up in Davy Jones Locker after going over the waterfall. So the High Peng is destroyed. All of the supplies and everything is stretched all over the shore. And then we see Gibbs, and he says, "This truly is a godforsaken place." And then Elizabeth comes up, and she says, "I don't see Jack. I don't see anyone." And then Barbossa says, "He's here. Davy Jones never once gave up without what he took." And then Will says, "And does it matter? We're trapped here by your doing, no different than Jack." And then we see Jack the monkey with the navigational charts. And then we see some of the crabs are going under Tia Dalma's dress. And she also has one in her hand. And she says, "Witty Jack is closer than you think." And then I love how on the left side of the screen, we start to see the black pearl crest over the sand hill. And I love everyone's shocked faces. And the music playing in this scene is very reminiscent of the introduction of Jack Sparrow in Curse of the Black Pearl. They're both scenes have Jack on the mast as the ship is sailing. And I just love everyone's faces in this scene. And the Black Pearl slides down that last dune and it slips right into the ocean. And then we see all of those crabs under the Black Pearl as well. And then I love how we just see Tai Huang and he's like, "Impossible." Then the pearl finally hits the water and Ragetti just says, "Boat." And then once the pearl hits the water, Jack comes over in a longboat and Gibbs says, "Slap me thrice and hand me to me mama. It's Jack." And then he starts to run over, and Elizabeth also wants to follow him, but she stops and kind of glances over at Will really quickly. She doesn't want Will to think that, she was happy to see Jack again. But Jack makes it over to land with everyone running over to him. And Pintel's like, "It's the captain!" And Gibbs is like, "A sight for sore eyes!" And then Jack yells out, "Mr. Gibbs!" And then Gibbs is like, "Aye, Captain." And then Jack's like, "I thought so. I expect you're able to account for your actions then." And then Gibbs is like super confused and he's like, "Sir?" And then Jack says, there has been a perpetual and virulent lack of discipline upon my vessel. Why? Why is that, sir? And then Gibbs is like, "Sir, you're in Davy Jones Locker, Captain." And then Jack takes a second and he's like, "I know that. I know where I am, and don't think I don't." And then Barbossa steps forward and he says, "Jack Sparrow." And then Jack looks over at him and he's like, "Ah, Hector. It's been too long, hasn't it?" And then I love how Barbossa says, "Aye, Isla de Muerta, remember? You shot me." And then I love how Jack laughs and he's like, "No, I didn't." And then he walks away and he just leaves Barbossa utterly confused. And he walks over to Tia Dalma and he's like, "Tia Dalma, out and about, eh?" And then he says, "You had an agreeable sense of the macabre to any delirium." And then Will is just like, "Ugh, he thinks we're a hallucination." And then Jack looks over at Will and he's like, "William, tell me something. Are you here because have you come because you need my help to save a certain distressing damsel, or rather, damsel in distress? Either one." And then Will's like, "No." And then Jack's like, "Well, then you wouldn't be here, would you? So you can't be here. QED, you're not really here." And then Elizabeth steps up and she says, "Jack," and he looks over and sees Elizabeth. And she says, "This is real, we're here." And seeing Elizabeth, Jack's eyes widen, and he runs back over to Gibbs, and he says, "The locker, you say?" And then Gibbs says, "Aye." And I think it's really, really cool how Jack thought he was in a complete hallucinative state, and these people weren't really here. But he sees Elizabeth, the person who killed him, and his eyes widen, and he's like, oh my god, they're actually here. So I think it's a really, really cool moment how Elizabeth was the one to trigger that. And Elizabeth steps closer, and she says, we've come to rescue you. And then Jack turns around and he's like, have you now? That's very kind of you. But it seems that as I possess a ship and you don't, you're the ones in need of rescuing, and I'm not as sure as I'm in the mood. And then Barbossa's like, I see my ship right there. And he points to the Black Pearl. And then Jack looks over and he's like, can't spot it. Must be a tiny little thing hiding somewhere behind the pearl. And then Will goes over to Jack and he's like, Jack, Beckett controls the heart of Davy Jones. He controls the Flying Dutchman. Then Elizabeth jumps over and she's like, he's taking over the seas. And then Tiadama says, the song has been sung. The Brethren Court is called. And then I love how Jack's like, leave you alone for a minute. Look what happens. Everything's going to pot. And then Gibbs is like, I, Jack, the world needs you back something fierce. And then Will says, and you need a crew. And then Jack turns around and he says this absolutely iconic line. And he says, why should I sail with any of you? 4 of you have tried to kill me in the past. 1 of you succeeded. And then Will immediately understands, and he looks over at Elizabeth, and Elizabeth is like, well. And then Jack says, oh, she's not told you. You'll have loads to talk about while you're here. And I love that moment. It's, of course, the realization for Will that Elizabeth was the one that killed Jack. But it's also a great line. And it's also a very interesting line when he says, 4 of you tried to kill me, 1 of you succeeded. A lot of people have been wondering who the 4 people are, and there's a lot of different explanations for this, so I'll go over them real quick. So some people interpret it as 4 people that tried to kill Jack, and one of those 4 people succeeded. And those 4 people were Barbossa, Will, Elizabeth, and then the other one is kind of like... no one's really sure. Some people say it's Tiadama, but like that one kind of works. Other people also think of it as 4 of you tried to kill me, and then another one of you succeeded, and that is Barbossa, Will, and Pintel and Rigetti, I think, and then the one that succeeded, of course, is Elizabeth. So I don't think it was ever confirmed the meaning of that line, like who the people were. But those are the few interpretations of it. But after he says that, Jack goes over to Tiadama and he says, eyes for you. And then Tiadama says, now, don't tell me you didn't enjoy it at the time. And then Jack's like, fine, it's all right, you're in. And then he goes over to Rigetti next and he's like, don't need you, you scare me. And he's like, Gibbs, you can come, Marty. And then he reaches Pintel and he's like, And then he goes over to Cotton and he's like, Cotton's parrot, I'm a little iffy, but at least I'll have someone to talk to. Then he goes over to Tai Huang and the rest of the Singapore pirates, and he's like, who are you? And then he's like, I'm Tai Huang. These are my men. And then Jack's like, where do your allegiances lie? And then Tai Huang's like, with the highest bidder. And then Jack's like, I have a ship. And then Tai Huang's like, that makes you the highest bidder. And then Jack's like, good man. And then Jack pulls out his compass and he's like, weigh anchor, prepare to make sail. And he sees his compass is not, it's just spinning. It's not stopping anywhere. And he's interrupted by Barbossa, who says, Jack, which way you going, Jack? And I love how we see the 5 people, or 6 people, including Jack the monkey, that Jack didn't want to come with them. And of course, Barbossa is holding the navigational charts. And I love this frame of Pintel, Rigetti, Barbossa, and Elizabeth and Will. Very, very cool. And then we go right over to the deck of the Black Pearl with one of my favorite comedic scenes in any Pirates of the Caribbean film. And it's just absolutely fantastic. And it's the dueling captains scene, which is absolutely fantastic. This scene is so funny. With Jack and Barbossa both trying to take command of the ship. And I love how in this scene we also see Gibbs, who is trying to like obey each of their commands, but is like confused as to which he should follow. So Barbossa first says, "Trim that sail," and then Jack, while he's saying that, Jack is like, "Slack windward brace and sheet." And then Barbossa's like, "Haul the pennant line," and Jack's like, "Haul the pennant line," and then they face each other. And then Barbossa's like, "What are you doing?" And then Jack's like, "What are you doing?" And then Barbossa's like, "No, what are you doing?" And then Jack's like, "What are you doing?" And then Barbossa's like, "No, what are you doing?" And then Jack's like, "What are you doing?" "Captain gives orders on the ship." And then Barbossa's like, "The captain of the ship is giving orders." And then Jack's like, "My ship makes me captain." And then Barbossa holds up the charts. He's like, "They be my charts." And then Jack's like, "That makes you chart man." And then as they're arguing, Pintel walks over and he yells at them. And he's like, "Stow it, the both of you. That's an order. Understand?" And then the funniest part of this scene is how after he yells, not just Jack and Barbossa stop and look at him. Literally every single person on the Black Pearl stops what they're doing and looks at Pintel. Like, it's just absolutely so great. Then we have a great close-up of Jack and Barbossa staring at him. And then Pintel's like, "Sorry, I just thought with the captain issue in doubt, I'd throw in my name for consideration. Sorry." And then he steps aside and lets Jack and Barbossa try to run up the staircase. And I love how they both try to run up the staircase at the same time. Then Ragetti pats him on the shoulder. He's like, "I'd vote for you." And Pintel's like, "Yeah." And then we go up to Jack and Barbossa again, and Barbossa pulls out a spyglass and looks through it. And then Jack pops over and he smiles, and Jack pulls out a spyglass of his own, and he extends it, and it's a little tiny one. And I love how he's angry with that, and then Barbossa just looks over and smirks at him. Absolutely great scene. The chemistry between Jack Sparrow and Barbossa, and just Johnny Depp and Jeffrey Rush, just absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's just, that scene will never not make me laugh. Like, it's one of the best comedic scenes in this whole entire franchise. But right after we go through this very funny scene, we go over to a very heartfelt scene, which is also one of my favorite scenes in this movie, which is Will and Elizabeth have a nice chat here. So Will is below deck and he sees Elizabeth sitting on the stairs. And he walks over to her, and we have this very angsty scene. And Will goes over and he says, "You left Jack to the Kraken." And then Elizabeth kind of shrugs it off and he's like, "He's rescued now, it's done with." And then Will turns around and kind of sighs, and Elizabeth stands up and he's like, "Will, I had no choice." And then Will just says, "You chose not to tell me." And I love that line so much. And Elizabeth just says, "I couldn't. It wasn't your burden to bear." And then Will turns around and he's like, "Well, I did bear, didn't I? I just didn't know what it was." And then he says, "I thought," and then Elizabeth finishes for him. He's like, "You thought I loved him." And I love how this, of course, this scene is also accompanied by some absolutely fantastic music by Hans Zimmer. And as Will and Elizabeth look at each other, Elizabeth tries to walk away, but Will pins her down, and Will just asks her, "If you make your choices alone, how can I trust you?" And then Elizabeth just replies, "You can't." And then she runs up the stairs, leaving Will to sulk by himself again. Oh my god. But if you thought it couldn't get any sadder, we're about to get to one of the saddest moments in movie history. Okay, just wait. Just wait a few minutes and we're going to get to literally one of the saddest scenes in any movie I've ever watched. Hopefully I can get through it without crying, but if you know what it is, you know what it is. But it's now nighttime, as the Black Pearl is sailing in the locker, and we see Pintel and Ragetti are fishing, which is also weird because there's no fish in Davy Jones Locker. But I love how they're chilling there, and Ragetti gets scared and drops his fishing line, and he sees dead bodies floating in the water. Well, not really dead bodies, but spirits of people who have died at sea, and they're kind of going through the water. And I love how Pintel's like, eerie. That's just downright macabre. I love how Pintel pronounces macabre. Like, that's downright macabre. It's so great. I love them so much. But as they see them floating through the water, Ragetti has this smart idea, and he's like, I wonder what would happen if you dropped a cannonball on one of them. And then they look at each other, and then we go over to Pintel and Ragetti holding some cannonballs, and as soon as they're getting back over to where they originally were, they see Tiadama standing there, and they drop the cannonballs. And then Pintel's like, be disrespectful, it would. And then we have this great moment with Tiadama, and she says, they should be in the care of Davy Jones. That be the duty him was charged with by the goddess Calypso, to ferry those who died at sea to the other side. And then she says, and every 10 years, him come ashore, and be with she who love him, truly. But the man has become a monster. And then Ragetti asks her, he's like, so he wasn't always tentacly? And then Tiadama says, no. Him was a man once. And we see her clutching the locket. And Pintel and Ragetti get closer to her, and they see something in the distance, and Ragetti says, now it's boats coming. And here we go. Hopefully I get through this without crying. But this is one of the saddest scenes. So we see a bunch of people in boats coming toward the Black Pearl. And Gibbs is loading a musket, and Will stops him, and he says, they're not a threat to us. And then he asks Tiadama, am I right? And then Tiadama says, we are nothing but ghosts to them. And then Barbossa says, it's best, just let him be. And then we see a bunch of these boats going past the Black Pearl. We see all of these people who have died at sea. And then we see a boat with Governor Weatherby Swann in it. And Elizabeth sees her father, and she says, it's my father, we've made it back. And then she yells out to him, and she's like, Father, here, look here. And then Jack walks over to her, and he says, Elizabeth, we're not back. And as soon as he says that, the look on Elizabeth's face, her heart just drops, and you can see her face. And she looks back over to her father, and you can see Will tries to reach out to grab her before she starts walking away. And she yells out to him, and she says, Father! And then he turns and looks at her, and he says, Elizabeth, are you dead? And then she says, no. And then Weatherby Swann says, I think I am. And Elizabeth's like, no, you can't be. And then, I love everything nuanced in this scene as well. The music in this scene, absolutely fantastic. Every little moment in this scene. So as they're talking, we have a quick shot that I want to mention of Pintel and Ragetti looking at each other. That I just want to mention just because there's so much packed in this scene. It's absolutely incredible. But Weatherby Swann says, there was this chest, you see. It's odd. At the time, it seemed so important. And then Elizabeth once again yells for her father to come aboard. And then Weatherby Swann says, "And a heart. I learned that if you stab the heart, yours must take its place." And then I love how, when he's saying that, we have a great shot of Will, and we see Tia Dalma walking up toward Will, which is another moment of foreshadowing for Will Turner's arc and where he will end up at the end of this movie. And he, of course, he says, "And you will sail the seas for eternity." And when he says that line, we have the close-up on Jack Sparrow, which is also something that motivates Jack for his arc in this movie. And Weatherby Swann says, "The Dutchman must have a captain. Silly thing to die for." And, of course, he's referencing this. There was a deleted scene. I'll bring it up just because it gives a little bit of extra... adds a bit more to this scene. There is a deleted scene called Swan Song, I think it's called, but it's with Governor Swann finding out all this information from Davy Jones, because he thinks that Elizabeth is dead and he goes to stab the heart. Davy Jones tells him all this information about, the heart and the curse and everything, and the scene ends with, Beckett getting ready to kill Governor Swann. I think it just adds a bit more to the scene. It's one of the scenes that I wish was in the film, and we'll talk about it in detail in a later episode. But that just adds a bit more to the scene. But Elizabeth yells over to Marty, and she's like, "Someone cast a line." And she yells out to her father, "Come back with us." And then it's the way that everyone is so in shock, and Elizabeth is the only one who's trying to really take initiative. You can see this with Marty, and he's just grabbing the ropes really slowly, and she just runs over to him and grabs the rope from him. And then we see Tia Dalma telling Will, "A touch of destiny." Another foreshadowing moment. And we see Elizabeth throw the rope over the side of the ship into her father's boat, and she says, "Take the line." And then Weatherby Swann just says, "I'm so proud of you, Elizabeth." And then she just yells at him, "Father, take the line, take the line." And then it slips off his boat, and she runs over to the stern of the ship. And then we see Tia Dalma yells, "She must not leave the ship." And this is one of the best parts of the scene, is how not just Will runs over. Of course, Will is the first one to run over. But not just Will runs. Tia Dalma runs, Pintel and Rigetti run, Gibbs runs, Barbossa runs, Tai Huang runs. Everyone runs. The only one who doesn't run is Jack, and he's just standing there absolutely in shock. But it's the fact that all these pirates, all of these merciless people who apparently didn't care about anyone, they only cared about themselves. They care about Elizabeth so much that they all run after her to stop her from jumping off the ship. It's those little things in this scene especially that it's great. And it's also the way when they get up to where Elizabeth is. Of course, Will gets there first, and Elizabeth is literally about to throw herself off the ship and pretty much kill herself. But you can see Will is yanking her off of the rigging. And it's the way how everyone runs up the stairs, and Gibbs just stands back and grabs onto the railing because he's scared. It's the little things, but when she's yelling for her father to come with them, and then he just says, "I'll give your love to your mother." And then Elizabeth just says, "Please, I won't let you go." And then Will grabs her off the rigging and hugs her as she cries in his arms. And at this point, everyone is crowded around them, all the main characters. They all care for them so much. And then, Will just asks Tia Dalma, is there a way? And then she just shakes her head and she says, "Him at peace." And finally, we are done with some heartbreaking scenes. We had a lot of just sadness there. But like that scene, it's executed so perfectly. It's such a sad scene. It's every like line that is delivered. Of course, a lot of people see this scene and it's like, oh, it's just, like progressing the plot because Weatherby Swann is telling them about the heart. But like, it is that, of course, it is that to relay that information to the heroes. But like, imagine being in Elizabeth's place. Imagine not, the last time she saw her father was in Port Royal at the beginning of Dead Man's Chest when he freed her from prison and then she escaped the carriage. That was the last time she saw her father. She had no idea what's happened to him. And then imagine being in her place and seeing your father and then realizing that he's dead. And finding out in that way. Like, just, it's absolutely heartbreaking to think about finding out that a loved one, especially for Elizabeth, her father was her only family member left. Like, it's just absolutely heartbreaking. And the way everyone, of course, no one really, of course, Keira Knightley is absolutely acting her ass off in this scene. Absolutely incredible. Jonathan Pryce is also fantastic in this scene, but it's also everyone else on the ship. All of our other main characters. They don't say anything in this scene, but like, the way that they stand there, the way they look at each other, the way they all run up and the looks on their faces, like, everyone in this scene is absolutely just acting their butt off. And you can't ask for a better scene than this. And I think, this is one of the scenes that really shows Gore Verbinski's talent and, his masterfulness on these films. I think this is one of the scenes that really shows how great of a director he is. But, it's the way that, Jack tells her, Elizabeth, we're not back. And, like, it's everything about that scene. I absolutely love that scene. I think it's absolutely perfect. But let's get past all of the sadness and melancholy. And let's go over to the next scene. And the sun is beginning to set. We see Pintel and Gibbs, and Pintel is trying to drink some water, but it's gone. He's like, no water. Why is all but the rum gone? And then we see Gibbs, and he's like, rum's gone too. So at this point, they're out of nourishment. They don't have any water. They have no food. They are pretty likely going to die if they don't get out of Davy Jones Locker. And Will is looking at Elizabeth, and then Tia Dalma goes over to him, and she says, if we cannot escape these doldrums before night, I fear we will sail on trackless seas, doomed to roam the reach between worlds forever. And then Gibbs comes over and he says, with no water, forever looks to be arriving a mite too soon. And then Will gets furious and he's like, why doesn't he do something? And of course he's referring to Barbossa, who is currently just standing at the bow of the ship, looking into the ocean, not doing anything. And we see Will and Gibbs walking about the deck, talking. And I love how we also see Rigetti losing his eye to Jack the monkey and chasing him down as well. And Will and Gibbs are talking, and Will says, yeah, and the green flash happens at sunset, not sunrise. And then Gibbs is like, over the edge. It's driving me over the bloomin' edge. Great line. And then Gibbs continues, and he's like, sunrises don't set. And then as he says this, we see Jack, who is playing with the navigational charts. And he flips and sees, sunrise sets flash of green. He flips it and he sees the words up is down. And then Jack says, up is down. That's just maddeningly unhelpful. Why are these things never clear? And then he hears himself, and the other Jack says, "Clear as mud, Jackie." And then Jack's like, "What? Eh?" And then we see a little Jack coming out of Jack's dreadlocks. And he says, "Stab the heart." And then we see another Jack come out on the other side of his dreadlocks, and he says, "Don't stab the heart." Then real Jack says, "Come again." And then the tiny Jack says, "The Dutchman must have a captain." And then real Jack says, "That's even more than less than unhelpful." And I love how this scene is a great kind of devil and angel on the shoulder scene, with the little Jacks here on Jack's shoulder. Very, very cool. And each Jack is trying to tell Jack what he wants in each side of that. So the Jack on the right says, "Sail the seas for eternity." And then real Jack says, "I love the sea." And then the other Jack says, "What about port?" And then Jack's like, "I prefer rum. Rum is good." And then Jack clarifies, and he's like, "Making port, where we can get rum and salty wenches once every 10 years. And then the other tiny Jack is like, "What did he say?" And then real Jack tells him, "Once every 10 years. And then tiny Jack says, "10 years is a long time, mate." And then real Jack says, "Even longer given the deficit of rum." And then tiny Jack says again, "But eternity is longer still." And then the other tiny Jack says, "And how will you be spending it? Dead or not?" And then tiny Jack says, "The immortal Captain Sparrow." And then real Jack says, "Oh, I like that." And then other tiny Jack says, "Come sunset, it won't matter." And then real Jack finally understands, and he's like, "Not sunset." And he looks down at the charts again and flips the center dial around so the ship is upside down. And he says, "Sundown and rise up." And then he gets up and he points over to the side of the ship. And he's like, "What's that?" And he runs over there, and Gibbs and Will go over to see what he's looking at. And then Jack's like, "What is that?" And I love how he's also talking to himself as well here. He's like, "I don't know. What do you think?" And then Gibbs is like, "Where?" And then Jack's like, "There." And then Barbossa's a little interested now. And Jack's like, "There." And he runs over to the other side of the ship, and Will and Gibbs follow him. And at this point, a lot of people are, wondering what he's seeing. And you can see the ship is starting to kind of rock back and forth very gently. And he runs over to the other side of the ship again, and then runs back to the other side. And Ragetti tries to grab his eye off the charts, drawing Barbossa's attention to it. And Barbossa looks down at the charts, and, everyone at this point is now also running back and forth. Taiwan, Elizabeth, Tiadama, everyone. And Elizabeth asks, "What is it?" And then Jack runs to the other side of the ship. And then we have this great scene of Barbossa sticking Ragetti's eye in his mouth and then slamming it back into Ragetti's eye socket. And then at this point, everyone's kind of realized what Jack is doing, and Pintel's like, "He's rocking the ship." And then Gibbs is like, We're rocking the ship." And then Barbossa looks down at the charts, and he sees up is down and the ship upside down, and he's like, "Aye, he's onto it." So as they continue to rock the ship, Pintel's like, "He's rocking the ship." And then Ragetti comes over to him with a bundle of rope, and he's like, "We'll tie each other to the mast upside down so when the boat flips, it'll be the right way up." And then Pintel's like, "Yes!" I can't believe I thought that would be a good plan. And then as they do that, everyone's still rocking the ship. Barbossa says, "Time it with the swell." And then he runs below deck, and he yells at everyone sleeping and down there. He's like, "Loose the cannons, you lazy bilge rats. Unstow the cargo. Let it shift." He grabs an axe and cuts everything loose. The whole crew is cutting the cannons loose, cutting the barrels loose, letting everything flow so the ship can really start rocking. Then we go right back up to Pinto and Ragetti, who are now tied upside down on the mast. How they did it themselves, I'm not too sure. I'm guessing someone helped them, but there they are. And I love how they're looking at everything upside down. Then we go back over. Everyone's still rocking. Barbossa comes out and is now rocking with everyone else. And we can really start seeing the ship starting to really rock. Like, it's starting to almost tip over. Everyone runs over, grabs on. At this point, it's getting really, really tough to do. It's getting very steep. Thankfully, everyone grabs the railing, but one pirate misses, and he rolls right off the ship into the water. And everyone starts to run to the other side again. We see all the cannons and everything coming over, breaking everything. They all grab onto the railing, and this, of course, was the last one they needed. The ship is starting to fall right over. One of the pirates falls off and gets hit right by a cannon on the rigging, and the ship starts to capsize, and Jack says, "Now up is down." And then the ship starts getting plunged right under the waves as everyone holds on tight, and the ship makes contact with the water and turns over in the waves. And Will loses his grip and starts sinking down in the ocean. And then we see this absolutely great underwater scene here with everyone holding onto the railing upside down. And then we go up to the setting sun as we see the keel of the Black Pearl just in the water. Then we have this great shot of everyone holding on underwater. We see, Tiadama and Barbossa and everyone. And then we have such a fantastic shot, such an iconic shot of the Black Pearl upside down underneath the water. And the camera just starts tilting and flips over. And then we see the Black Pearl right side up beneath the waves. And the sky is below them. Absolutely great shot. One of my favorite shots in Pirates of the Caribbean. I just love that, how, the real world was below them. Very cool. And then we go back up and we see the sun has set and we see the green flash. And Jack feels something, below the ship, and he starts to see the Black Pearl is going further and further beneath the water, and he sees the surface, and the ship breaks the surface and is once again back in the land of the living. We have escaped Davy Jones Locker, and we are now finally back in the real world. So everyone is completely drenched, but thankfully everyone made it. And I love how Pintel and Rigetti are still tied upside down, and Pintel's like, "This was your idea." And then Gibbs looks up and he's like, "Blessed sweet Westervus, we're back." And then everyone looks and sees the sunrise, and Elizabeth says, "It's the sunrise." Finally, showing them that they are back in the real world. And Barbossa looks and he immediately flips over and pulls out a pistol and aims it at Jack. And then everyone else, Will pulls out a pistol, Elizabeth pulls out a pistol, Gibbs pulls out a pistol, Jack pulls out a pistol, and they pull out second pistols to aim at the other people pointing at them. And even Jack the Monkey pulls out a pistol. And I love how Jack the Monkey aims his pistol at Cotton's parrot, and Cotton's parrot's like, "What? Parlay?" And then I love how Pintel and Rigetti are like, "We need our pistols, get untied, hurry." And then everyone's aiming their pistols at each other, and then Barbossa just starts to laugh. And he's like, "Ha ha 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 ha." And then everyone starts to laugh with him, and they're all having a great time. And they all just put their pistols down and start laughing at each other. And then they all have this great laugh, and they're like, "All right then." And they all pull up their pistols again. And then Barbossa's like, "The Brethren Court is a-gather in a shipwreck cove, and Jack, you and I are a-going, and there'll be no arguing that point." Then Jack's like, "I is arguing the point. If there's pirates a-gathered, I'm pointing my ship the other way." Then Elizabeth pulls her other pistol and points both of them at Jack, and she's like, "The pirates are gathering to fight Beckett, and you're a pirate." And Jack points his second pistol at Elizabeth. And then Will then points both of his pistols at Jack, and he says, "Fight or not, you're not running, Jack." And then Jack then flips one of his pistols over to Will, And then Barbossa says, if we don't stand together, they'll hunt us down one by one. And then Gibbs flips one of his pistols over to Barbossa. And then Barbossa continues, and there'll be none left but you. And then Jack's like, I quite like the sound of that. Captain Jack Sparrow, the last pirate. And then Barbossa steps forward and says, I, and he points a pistol at Jack and points his second one at Gibbs behind him. And he's like, and you'll be fighting Jones alone. Now, how does that figure into your plan? And then Jack's like, I'm still working on it. But I will not be going back to the locker, mate. You can count on that. And then they try to fire their pistols, but they realize wet powder, as Gibbs says. The powder's wet, their pistols will not fire. So they all shrug it off and walk away. And I love how Pintel and Rigetti finally got untied, and Pintel's like, wait, we can still use them as clubs. And then I love how Rigetti pulls out his and smacks Pintel in the head with it. And he's like, ow. And then Rigetti's like, sorry. Effective, though. So then Will rolls out the Malkoon map, and he points to one of the islands on the map. And he's like, there's a freshwater spring on this island. We can resupply there and get back to shooting each other later. And then Jack says, you lead the shore party, I'll stay with my ship. And then Barbossa looks at him, he's like, I'll not be leaving my ship in your command. And then Will has the great idea, and he's like, why don't you both go ashore and lead the ship in my command? And then I love how Barbossa and Jack both stare at him, and he's like, temporarily. And that finally convinces Barbossa and Jack, and I love how Barbossa pulls out his spyglass again to look at the island in the distance, and then we see Jack pulls out this absolutely ginormous spyglass. And I just love Barbossa looking over and smiling at him. Great moment. And then we go over to a kind of like very reminiscent scene from Dead Man's Chest. We see Pintel and Rigetti in a rowboat, and they get capsized by a big wave, which is exactly what happens to them in Dead Man's Chest when they arrive on the Isla de Pelagostos. So I like that reference there. And the shore party is now on this island, and we're now at another one of my favorite scenes, not just in this movie, but one of my favorite scenes in this entire franchise. And this is maybe some of you guys' favorite scene as well. This is just an absolutely fantastic scene with Jack and Barbossa. So once they get on this island, they start coming out of their boats, and we see Jack and Barbossa staring at something in the distance. And we haven't seen what it is yet, but Barbossa then turns his gaze and stares at Jack with this kind of look on his face, and Jack just has this expression on his face that I just love. And then he starts to walk forward, and Barbossa follows him, and then Pintel and Rigetti see what they were looking at, and Pintel's like, crimey, and Rigetti's like, odds bodkins. And then we finally see what they were looking at, and it's none other than the Kraken's dead corpse, just chilling on this island. And this moment as they walk toward it has an absolutely fantastic swell of music. Another shout out to Hans Zimmer. This music here, the swell, I love it so much for many reasons. You can hear so many things in it. So you can hear the Kraken's theme. So the main thing is a very slow swell, but if you listen to it very closely, you can hear part of the Kraken music theme from Dead Man's Chest. And you can also hear in this theme, you can also hear the East India Trading Company theme. The dan 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 dan. And maybe I'll just play the swell here because it's absolutely fantastic. And you can really hear all of these different things in it. And you also, of course, you hear the East India Trading Company theme with that because Beckett ordered Davy Jones to kill the Kraken. And I just think it's absolutely cool to see finally seeing the Kraken in full, and also just seeing it dead, this absolute monster of the seas, just lying dead because of Beckett. And I'll get to that that point in a little bit after we cover the dialogue in the scene. So Jack finally reaches the Kraken, and Pintel and Ragetti are poking at it with a stick, and they're like, "Careful, careful!" And then Pintel's like, "You stupid fish!" And they start climbing on it. And then I love how Ragetti's like, "Actually, it's a cephalopod." And they're like, "Serves you right." And then I love how Ragetti's like, "Pin, I bet people would pay a shilling to see this." And then Pintel's like, "Pintel and Ragetti, Kraken slayers." And then Ragetti's like, "We can serve up a slice as a souvenir." I love that. But we can see a great shot of Jack Sparrow getting right up close to the eye of the Kraken, and Barbossa following behind him. And this dialogue here is absolutely incredible. So we see Jack staring at the Kraken. Of course, the Kraken is what killed him. And he is just staring at it. And Barbossa says, "Still thinking of running, Jack? Think you can outrun the world? You know the problem with being the last of anything is by and by there'll be none left at all." And then Jack turns to him and he says, "Sometimes things come back, mate. We're living proof, you and me." And Barbossa says, "Aye, that's a gamble of long odds, ain't it? There's never a guarantee of coming back, but passing on, that's dead certain." And then Jack processes this for a second and he says, "Summoning the Brethren Court, then, is it?" And then Barbossa says, "It's our only hope, lad." And then Jack says, "Well, that's a sad commentary in and of itself." And then Barbossa says, "The world used to be a bigger place." But Jack shakes his head and he's like, "The world's still the same. There's just less in it." And he starts to walk away. And Barbossa kind of ponders that for a second. And this scene is just absolutely incredible. I just love Jack facing the beast that killed him, obviously. Just fantastic. And what Barbossa tells him, think you can outrun the world. I love Barbossa's dialogue, There's never a guarantee of coming back, but passing on, that's dead certain. And I love how, when Barbossa says the world used to be a bigger place, and Jack shakes his head no, and he's like, the world is still the same. There's just less in it. And, of course, also kind of referring to the Kraken, who is dead. And it's a very great meaning of this scene, how the mystery of the seas, what Jack loved most was the mystery of the ocean, the mystery of the seas. And with Beckett controlling everything, he's taking the mystery out of the seas and he's making the world look smaller. He's connecting the dots, he's filling the maps. The maps aren't blank anymore. So, Barbossa thinks the world is smaller, but Jack says no, the world's still the same size. There just isn't as much, mystery and intrigue in it as there once was. And it really reinforces that kind of end of an era feeling we get from At World's End. That it's interesting how On Stranger Tides and Dead Men Tell No Tales don't really touch on this. But at this point in the timeline, we're kind of like in the 1720s, like at the end of the 1720s, potentially going into the 1730s. And if you know real world history, the golden age of piracy took place within this time, and it was kind of coming to an end around the time this movie is taking place. And it's great to kind of see the movie touch on that, and it's something it's strange how the next two movies don't touch on it at all. They kind of just assume the pirates are still roaming the seas, which was still happening, but the next two movies take place like 10 years after this movie. So at that point, kind of piracy was it wasn't as strong as it once was in the golden age of piracy, where we kind of at the end of in this film. And it's interesting how those movies never touched on that. But I love how we have that kind of that sense of this is the end for us feeling in this movie. And it's, very obvious later on in the film when the pirates fight or declare war on the East India Trading Company. But it's just absolutely incredible. And it's one of my favorite scenes in this whole franchise because of it touching on that theme of, the end. But let's move on real quick and finish up this scene. We see our island party going through the jungle, and Jack and Barbossa stumble upon a dead corpse in a little pond. And Barbossa tastes some of the water, and then he immediately spits it out, and he says, "Poison, foul by the body." And then Pintel pulls the guy up, and he says, "Hey, I know him. He was in Singapore." And then immediately after that, Cotton's parrot is like, "Squawk, Singapore." And then Marty's like, "Captain." And he looks over, and we see Rigetti on the shore. He's like, "Oi, we got company." And then we see the Empress Sao Fang's ship nearing the Black Pearl. And right after this, Tai Huang aims his pistol at Jack, and the rest of the Singapore pirates aim their pistols at him and Barbossa and Pintel. And as soon as they do this, I also love how Tai Huang's gun also has a nice little blade on the end of it as well that pops out. And I love how he just stands there, and then Jack just points to Barbossa. He's like, "He's the captain." And then Barbossa just rolls his eyes. And then the Singapore pirates bring Jack, Barbossa, Pintel and Rigetti, Marty and Cotton back onto the Black Pearl, where they are pretty much in control. And this is a great stopping point to end this episode. So we're about a little over an hour in, which leaves us about an hour and 40 minutes left in this film. But I think it's a great time to end this episode. We've covered a lot of stuff. We went all the way through Davy Jones Locker. We had some very sad and heartbreaking moments. We had some very introspective, great scenes that you can really ponder on and think about. And it just really kind of shows why this movie is so good. It touches on so many subjects. But yeah, I won't ramble on any longer because this episode is already 70 minutes long. So that'll be where we end it for this episode. Next week, we'll continue right where we left off with At World's End. I hope you join us. Thank you for listening to this podcast so far. As I said, it's now on a bunch of other podcast platforms that you can also listen on. So I thank you for listening. Please rate and review wherever you are listening. And I thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email or a question, send it over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. You can also follow this podcast on Twitter at podcastpotc and on Instagram at Podcast of the Caribbean. I post some fun trivia, some fun photos and videos over there. Make sure you go check it out and give it a follow. And be sure to keep a weather eye on the horizon. And always remember, dead men tell no tales.